This lecture covers the China topic that you will be debating in September and October in public forum debate. Now, there are two different potential resolutions. The European Union should join China's Belt and Road Initiative, and on balance, Xi Jinping's power consolidation is beneficial to the People's Republic of China. Now, as you may know, if the members of the National Speech and Debate Association had the opportunity to vote to choose one of these topics before September and October, and whichever one they vote for will win. So there's no guarantee that either one of these topics will win. So I'll spend a little bit of time discussing both, and they do intersect, but it is most likely that the first topic will win because that is the topic that almost all of the debate camps are using, and usually that is the one that ends up winning because all the coaches at those camps do end up voting for the topic, and the debaters who attend those camps will pressure their coaches into voting for that resolution. So it's most likely that the first one will win. It's possible that the second one will win, and we'll spend some time discussing both just because it's important to understand both of these. It's very difficult to understand the Belt and Road Initiative without understanding Xi's consolidation of power. And that's the way that these intersect. If the EU were to join the EU, the European Union, were to join the Belt and Road Initiative, that would really help Xi consolidate his power even more. And if they didn't join, then maybe potentially that could weaken Xi, though no one really expects the European to join now. So probably really wouldn't, a failure to join probably wouldn't weaken him. But if the European Union joined, that would substantially strengthen Xi's power. Second, this stronger Xi, which has occurred through power consolidation, will probably make it more likely that the BRI will be finished. The BRI, or the Belt Road Initiative, is the signature kind of legacy item of President Xi. He's the one who started this back in 2012 when he presented it in Kazakhstan, and he's been pushing and developing it ever since. The third thing is that there are many similar terminal impacts. There's arguments related to China's economy, China's overall stability, China's military power, and international relations. And these things will be debated on both topics, and just kind of understanding them and debating them is very important. I wouldn't pick one of these this summer, necessarily only focus on that. I would do a little bit of research on both because the research does overlap, and I'm going to talk about Xi a bit now. But of course, like I said, it is number one that is most likely to win. So a few things to understand. Let's look at Xi himself. Well, who is Xi Jinping? So you understand that Xi is the family name, and Jinping is the last name. It's just an inversion of what you would consider the first and last names in kind of the English-dominated world. Xi is the General Secretary of the Communist Party. That's one title he has. He's also the President of the People's Republic of China. He's the Chairman of the Central Military Commission. He got the title Paramount Leader since 2012. And he's used an anti-corruption campaign to purge or get rid of many officials that maybe were considered to be challengers to Xi. So he uses to consolidate his power. He's a Chinese nationalist. He came up with the idea and the concept, what's called the China Dream, that China will become a great power. This is really no different than Trump's kind of Make America Great Again, or Modi, who just won the election of India, kind of with the phrase or the slogan, "Good days are coming." So you have the rise of nationalist leaders throughout the world. Trump, as much as he's criticized for being a nationalist leader, is certainly not the first nationalist leader of a large country. You see, Xi back in 2012. We see coming up with the China Dream. We see Modi, who just won elections. Certainly, we have Trump. We have Putin in Russia, a nationalist leader. We had the reemergence of nationalist leaders throughout Europe. Xi has been much more aggressive in asserting China's foreign policy interests, vis-a-vis Japan, their historical rivalries, and throughout the South China Sea. He has supported the development of Africa and Asia initiatives through One Belt, One Road, which I'll define a little bit more in a bit. Xi has increased military spending, building aircraft carriers. I believe they're on their second or third aircraft carrier. And this is the U.S. has 11 aircraft carriers, and after that, now I think it's China, and I think Russia has like one. So there's still a pretty big gap. But Xi is modernizing and developing aircraft carriers. Is starting to challenge the U.S. diplomatically and economically. Obviously, have very much a rise of China's power. There's increased aggression in the South China Sea area that you can read a lot. He's aggressively promoting China's kind of name and influence in world affairs. Within China, they're sending Muslims to what are called re-education camps. Some people call them concentration camps. They're probably not exactly the same, though the West does not know a lot about these camps. They're kept in secret, but they're trying to kind of create, kind of drive out these minority groups and kind of push everybody into kind of this China dream, this one karma China value systems. There's a kind of a re-emphasis on censorship. There, in the U.S. you have things like WhatsApp and Instagram and Facebook, and there's really no censorship on anything of those, at least by the government. I mean, the companies may impose their own standards, but there's no government censorship. You do have that in China on their common WeChat applications. There's a lot of population monitoring, surveillance. We now have in China, you see the development of social credit scores. So in the U.S., in other countries, you have a credit score based on how well you pay your bills. There you have a social credit score based on how well you kind of interact and behave. And he's aggressively promoting a model of state-controlled capitalism where the state is heavily involved in the management of the economy. There is still capitalism in terms of the development of the industry, but the state is managing that, and we'll see that a lot on the Belt and Road. He's like I said, has an anti-corruption campaign that's designed to get, at least partially designed to get rid of opponents because they can be accused of being corrupt. There is a kind of a drive to reduce corruption as well because it is a problem in China. And he's kind of even consolidated his power even greater by becoming the chair of the National Security Commission. He's in charge of steering committees on economic and social reform, committees on restructuring and modernization. He's the chair of the new Internet Commission. They have got rid of term limits in China for the presidency, right? So in China, there were 2-year terms. You could only be the president twice, and then you couldn't be the president anymore. Those were recently abolished, and Xi can be elected president forever, which is what people expect to happen, especially since it's not even really a completely free country. The same thing happened in Russia, right? There were term limits abolished for Putin. He can be the president there forever. And of course, Trump kind of dreams about being the president forever and abolishing these term limits. Forbes says he's the most powerful person in the world. And he created the One Belt, One Road initiative. And I really want to stress to me, I've been talking a bit about how much Xi has consolidated his power and how strong he is, and you keep thinking, well, I'm debating the Belt and Road Initiative topic maybe at my camp, or I'm going to the Belt and Road Initiative is most likely going to win. But the Belt and Road Initiative, as we'll learn, is the signature Chinese kind of foreign policy agenda item, and it's all kind of backed and kind of undergirded by this consolidated power of Xi to push this through, to promote China worldwide, to help China develop its economy, to help it promote its military. So the whole Belt and Road Initiative is really backed by both the power and the ideals of Xi, and it was created, as I said, in 2012. A few other relevant facts about China that you should understand before we get into the more detailed discussion of the Belt and Road is that China does currently have a pretty high growth rate, which is around 7%. That's very high. Like the U.S. growth rate, 2.5%, 3%, maybe gets up around 3.5%. China's is around 7%. Now, that's not just because China's like some great country like compared to the U.S. China is still technically a developing country, and developing countries, as they emerge, always have high growth rates. You can see China's even high growth rate at one point was as high as 15%, right? So China is a developing country. When it's emerging like it is going to have a higher growth rate, but that's a pretty high growth rate. It's also the second largest economy by gross domestic product, by the total amount of economic activity. It does have the highest purchasing power, and it's projected to surpass the U.S. economy. China has 1.43 or 1.5 billion people you can think of. Now, the U.S. population is only 350 million. So it's really like probably at this point, probably almost close to 5 times as many people in China, which explains the purchasing power differential, but also why GDP is going to grow so much, the total amount of economic activity. Its military budget, it's hard to determine because obviously, you say it's a communist country, but so everything is not public. But a lot of people put it in the $300 billion range. The U.S. is at $650 billion and growing, is quite larger than that. But China's military spending is rapidly increasing. The rate of increase is much higher than in the U.S., and it is a leader in some technologies, especially artificial intelligence. Some people say that China will surpass the United States in artificial intelligence, and that can be related to the Belt Road Initiative. And obviously, artificial intelligence has huge military implications. So that's some important kind of background to understand. Like I say, it's very important to understand who President Xi is and how much power he has consolidated and the influence he has in China, and how much has China developed this dream and its kind of growing economy and its growing military power and its growing potential to be, certainly it is one of the 2 global leaders at the moment, and a lot of people say China could become the global leader. So it's within that context that I introduced the One Belt and One Road Initiative. The One Belt and One Road Initiative, like I say, it's a global development strategy by the Chinese government that's aimed at kind of promoting infrastructure development and investment. It says in up to 152 countries, but largely in kind of what you would call Eurasia, certainly in Asia and China. And I'll show you the map here in a bit, as it kind of grows down into South Asia and then over into the eastern parts of Europe. It has 2 parts. The belt refers to the overland routes, okay, the belt and the rail transportation, and then the silk. All right, and then we also have the silk economic belt, and then you have the road, which refers to the sea routes or the maritime Silk Road. Most people think of the belt like it's primarily about land, but there are some parts of the sea that are relevant. So it is kind of this way of connecting, building infrastructure and connecting kind of all these seaports and land ports, creating these seaports and land, what are essentially land ports or trading centers, and building the overland routes to get there. Now, it is not a formal legal thing. It is a concept, which you think about, and I haven't really teased this out completely. What does it mean for the European Union to join this? But it does mean to kind of actively or publicly say they are participating in this. It does include telecommunications. So, for example, as this piece of evidence shows, since Xi inaugurated the BRI, as I discussed, right, the focus has shifted from geographical boundaries to digital boundaries. The idea behind Xi's digital push is to build digital infrastructure and develop internet communications along the Silk Road, China's modern-day Silk Road. It's an attempt to revive and extend it beyond the hard infrastructure towards soft infrastructure. And I'll talk about that more later when I talk about the pros and the cons. But the idea, as you're seeing in the world, that telecommunications networks and internet companies are kind of really starting to be regarded by countries as strategic assets that they want to control. They want to, they want people to use their internet networks. So obviously they knew, because then they know what everyone is doing on the networks. They can learn about the people. They can learn about their populations. Learn about where they're doing, where they're going, right? You have location services. They know what you like and don't like because you press the like button on Facebook. They know who your friends are because that's what you do on a social media network. You establish friends, and by learning about your friends, they see what interests your friends have. They know your socioeconomic profile. They can determine your race, all these types of things. They figure out your age, and all this data is kind of collected and analyzed into one source. So the digital part of this Belt and Road Initiative is something that will be debated a lot on this topic. Now, on this next map, you can kind of see China's proposed new Silk Roads, right? So you see a kind of essentially the land route, right, which is going to kind of start there over in China and build itself all the way through up into the north and through the west, down through, you can see all the countries, even crossing through crossing through Iran, up through Turkey. We have some connection in Moscow and Russia, and they have some into the Netherlands, which is joint. But as you can see, that gray area in the top left is Europe, and there's really not much of a connection there. There's a little bit of a connection because some individual European countries have decided to join the Belt and Road Initiative, but you can see the potential there to expand through that mass. Then you see the maritime Silk Road, right, which again starts in eastern China and even in parts of Vietnam, like we can see Hanoi, and it goes all the way through down in what you call the Indo-Pacific area, which has become a new kind of a contestant point along these different routes, right? So we have different essentially trade routes, right? We have trade routes, a land trade route, we have the one belt, we have the one road then which refers to the maritime Silk Road. And you can even see now too that China, we can see a little bit of a route developing through Pakistan as well, which if you debated the India Security Council resolution, you may have read a little bit about that China was building ties with Pakistan and developing part of the Belt Road there. Now then the next slide, there's this link to the a video which you should watch. It's from Vox. It's a very good kind of explanation of the belt, the One Belt, One Road initiative. And so this PowerPoint is in the is available to our subscribers in the Dropbox folder. So I highly encourage you to click on it. If you don't have access to that, if you just go to YouTube and type in Belt Road Initiative and Vox, VOX, you can find this video. It's very good. It already has over 4 million views. I do want to kind of quickly note there, hopefully you do watch this video, but this is often referred to as the BRI, or the Belt Road Initiative, or OBOR, One Belt, One Road. It also can be referred to as the MSRI, the Maritime Silk Road Initiative. So those are all keywords that you can use in addition to just saying, the Belt Road Initiative or, OBOR. You can type all of these things into Google when you're doing your searching, and you can see that it is a, very common. That's how you're going to find research on this topic. And I do want to kind of emphasize that, yes, it is an infrastructure project, but as this kind of evidence from this recent hearing in the United States on the project indicates, it's generally perceived as an infrastructure project. It's true, but it's not just that. It's a comprehensive vision for regional, political, economic, and financial integration kind of under the leadership of Beijing, which is the capital of China. So with that background in mind, let's talk about the EU, the Europe part of the topic. The resolution asks whether or not Europe should join the Belt Road Initiative. Now, the European Union is a political and economic union of 28 member states. It may decrease because the UK is trying to withdraw from the European Union, but it's an economic and political organization made up of countries primarily in Europe that covers an estimated 513 million people. So think about it. China has approximately 1.5 million people, 1.5 billion people, right? So, and then if another 500 million people were to join, that would give China 2 billion kind of people under the kind of influence or control of and joining to this Belt Road Initiative, which is obviously a very substantial number of people, especially considering that is a lot of the major purchasing power of the world, right? It does exclude like the United States and Canada, and of course Latin America, or South America, I could say, but that is not like South America. I mean, there's not as much economic activity. There's obviously a lot of poverty now in South America, so that is not as big of a loss, but that would give China essentially kind of control over Eurasia, Europe and Asia combined. If you think of that as kind of one landmass, it's obviously composed of more than one continent, but you get the basic idea that would be a huge area for China to kind of have substantial economic control over. The EU, the European Union, has said it will not join as a bloc. Now, I have seen a piece of evidence that says that, within that, some countries have still joined, and the European Union is not really going to necessarily stop them from joining. But I haven't seen a list that includes 1/2, but 16 East European countries have joined. The big thing to understand is, with the exception of Italy, obviously a small country, Western European countries have not joined onto the Belt Road Initiative. And in April even of 2018, the European Union sent envoys to China and issued a statement that saying the BRI ran counter to their agenda for liberalizing trade, and pushed the balance of power too far in favor of subsidized Chinese companies. And I'll talk about subsidized Chinese companies and kind of state-managed capitalism a little bit more. But basically, the European countries decided not to join the initiative, probably really for many different reasons. But one of the articulated reasons, which I'll talk about more later, is that they didn't really think they can kind of compete in this world of state-managed capitalism where China provided kind of enormous benefits to its own countries. Now, so having the European Union decide to join the Belt and Road Initiative is really a radical change in its policy to join as a bloc, to join as a group. The purpose of the European Union is to develop a common, especially a common economic policy, common trade policy. It certainly does have some security policies, though that is kind of more under the influence of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which many of the European countries are members, not all, but many, And they just kind of decided essentially kind of not to do this, to kind of stick more with the West or the United States, which I'll talk about. So having them decide to join the Belt and Road Initiative is very significant. And teams are going to need to articulate why the European Union should join the Belt and Road Initiative. Surely there will be some debate about whether or not the Belt and Road Initiative is kind of good on its merits, and I'll talk about the links to that. But obviously, a critical component of this debate is whether or not the EU should join. Now, what are some potential reasons teams could argue that the EU should join this? Well, the first is I think you can make a strong case for European unity. There is a lot of fighting that's occurring between the European Union and or countries, I should say, that are members of the European Union but have decided to join on their own, such as Italy in particular, and some of the Eastern European countries, and then other countries within the EU who do not want Europe to be a part of this, and they're fighting a lot. But if the EU decided to join as an entity, if there was kind of a unifying commitment amongst all of these countries, then that would reduce conflict really within Europe. And I think you could say that conflict is bad. There's evidence that says that the future of the European Union is uncertain. There's obviously economic tension between these countries. As I mentioned earlier, there's a birth of kind of nationalism within some of these. Certainly in Europe, wars have definitely been fought in Europe in the past. So I think you could just say if they joined together, the European Union decided to join, this would be a commitment to unity. Now, there may still be some fighting that occurs about implementation, but I think that's an argument that you can make. The second is that it's better to have the EU do this, even though some individual countries have joined. These countries really do have obligations to the EU on things such as trade that are really kind of determined by the EU. So they might not be able to fully participate as much as they want because there are obligations to the EU and EU trade policies that since the European Union has decided not to join, they're not going to be able to really become kind of essentially maybe like full-fledged members of this. The third is I found a pretty good piece of evidence that says that the EU can kind of provide the capital or help raise the rest of the capital and financing that's necessary to complete this project. So at least the initial stages of the project, a good amount of the project, the estimated costs are around $3 trillion. And people say that China could really contribute kind of up to $1.5 trillion of that, but to really kind of complete the projects, especially into like Western Europe, that what China really has to be provided is some more capital, and that the European Union could supply that additional capital. And they're not going to provide it directly. It's not like the EU has that type of a budget as an entity, but they could go to banks and other types of investors in Europe to help raise the funds by putting their name behind it and pushing them to support things that are of value to the government, right? That they could really join. That their joining would help raise the capital necessary to complete the project. And if you're really talking about whether maybe just half the project can be complete versus the whole project, then you are kind of thinking about a sizable expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative. So even just kind of general arguments about the environment, and things like that really kind of do then start to apply, because you're talking about such a massive expansion. You can debate about maybe saying, okay, this will push China more to comply with European trade rules. You could also say it's the best way to determine where these corridors should be built, rather than kind of, randomly in countries that happen to join individually and allow corridors to be built in their area. Perhaps the EU could decide comprehensively as to where to put this. But as I kind of want to emphasize, the European Union has really decided not to do this. They've even kind of endorsed kind of a contrary competitive strategy known as the connectivity strategy. As this piece of evidence indicates, the EU is the latest actor to enter the Great Game being kind of geopolitical or competition among Europe. For the 28-member bloc is launching its own connectivity strategy aimed at linking Europe to Asia. The broader picture suggests that Brussels, in Belgium, that's where the head of the EU is sending a clear signal not just to Beijing, the capital of China, but also to Moscow, the capital of Russia, that it is a contender in the race to secure competing areas of influence. A multilateral, meaning many-country alternative to American unilateralism or single power. Of course, in truth, this amounts to little more than semantics. For Washington, the United States has long used the Union, as well as NATO, to further its European and Central Asian interests, as witnessed in Moscow at the close of the last century. Meaning the U.S. will not regard such EU maneuverings as a threat to its regional interests, but most likely as supplementing these. So really they're saying that right now the European Union, this piece of evidence is saying that the European Union has developed its own strategy, okay, and that this strategy is very, very important in terms of getting the kind of the overall backing for a project that kind of essentially provides them with access to Asia and these Asian markets and Asian geopolitical influences without kind of joining China's Belt and Road Initiative. So that's one thing to think about when you're researching. You find a lot of con arguments probably by researching the connectivity strategy and arguing that it is the current and better approach for Europe to take, and it is something that aligns with the U.S. interests. Now, that background being provided, and it's kind of a substantial amount of background, but it is kind of a background that I think is very important to understand. Let's look at the pros and the cons. And I've broken down each of these arguments to the pros, so we're going to look at the benefits to Europe, the benefits to China, the overall benefits to the world. Then on the con, I'll do the same thing. The overall benefits to Europe, the benefits to China, the benefits to the world. So what are some potential benefits to Europe? Well, first of all, there's a group of arguments that say this could help Europe economically. That joining the BRI will increase Europe's exports to China, reducing the trade deficit that Europe has with China, which is currently quite substantial. It also result in the building of stronger infrastructure within Europe that could be used to kind of increase trade and increase the efficiency of trade within that. If Europe joins as a bloc, there's going to be more unity and trade within Europe, right? That the current agreement, as I mentioned, kind of causes conflict within the EU, but this could facilitate kind of less conflict and more trade, improving the economy. That maybe Europe could get access to needed capital from China, money, needed infusions. As we said, China has a good amount of money to invest. It could just even increase investments with their own within their own countries, that the EU is able to kind of help the banks or get banks to contribute to this initiative, and it strengthens infrastructure within Europe. There may be kind of more compliance with they join with European standards, which may facilitate trade. And Europe could come in and push its own standards as members of the BRI. So that's kind of can be related to the economy in terms of kind of all maybe kind of trade standards that maybe China would be pressured into adopting. But we could also see maybe in particular some environmental standards that Europe uses in trade agreements to help protect the environment, that China kind of would need to comply with these. We can see the same things in terms of human rights standards, that right now China controls the Belt Road Initiative. If Europe joins and has more influence, it can push its agenda, especially if it brings a lot of money to the table, and this could result in improvements in human rights. So there's a couple categories of arguments there. Now there's another category of arguments where you say that Europe's going to get access to China's 5G technology, right? 5G is kind of your next level of network technology. Your phones are kind of probably at this point mostly on 4G. If you travel abroad to other parts of the world, sometimes you don't get 4G or even get 3G. But 5G, and I don't understand all the technology behind it, but 5Gs are super fast networks that kind of allow for the certainly more sophisticated networks in terms of even data that's collected. There's evidence. If you probably none of you probably debated this topic, but Public Forum even had a topic about the Internet of Things. Normally, we connect our computers and our phones to the Internet, but now people have Alexa connected to the Internet. They have their watches connected to the Internet. They have a variety of different things that are connected to the Internet. And some people say the only way to really support this Internet of Things is to have 5G technology, because imagine now if in your house you have 10 or 20 different items connected to one another, right? Or connected to the Internet, right? This is going to take up a lot of bandwidth. So as people say, this is important to the development of the Internet of Things. This could, of course, benefit Europe. And of course, there are potential downsides to this, which we'll discuss. And I think the 5G debate will become a very kind of popular argument on the topic, but that's there. You can also say the status quo kind of the telecommunications infrastructure is dependent on a lot of sea cables. So when you communicate with someone over the Internet in another continent, you're basically communicating across cables that are kind of on the ocean floor. Now these create there's some potential for disruptions amongst the cables, especially in wartime. But if you have additional cables that are laid on land, that could create some redundancy. I mean, there's obviously a potential that those cables could be disrupted, but that does kind of create some redundancy that makes kind of internet communications potentially more secure. You could talk about the general benefits of science and technology cooperation from Europe, and that it helps Europe build ties with other countries, particularly in South Asia or other parts of Asia that are kind of essentially already in the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the details of all these arguments, one good thing about Public Forum is that there's a lot of detail to a lot of the arguments. These could all get fleshed out like a little bit more in terms of exactly how much trade would increase, maybe trade in some certain products, maybe trades in some particular industries, maybe the capital is needed for particular projects. So a lot of these arguments will kind of come out in more detail as the debates develop. But this kind of gives you a pretty good general overview of the topic in terms of the benefits for Europe. Now, why is this good for China? Well, as this quote kind of indicates, it's quote, whoever is able to build and control infrastructure linking the two ends of Eurasia will rule the world. Just look at a map, right? If you kind of say, depending on how your map or your globe is kind of structured, generally you're going to kind of see China on the right of this large Asian landmass, and then you're going to see Europe on the left. Imagine if that whole area was connected, especially if there's even a little bit of connection of Russia, which is over in the north, and a little bit of South Asia. Imagine if all those kind of areas or most of those areas are connected through a One Belt and Road initiative that's controlled by China, or I should say, inclusive of land routes, sea routes, and now kind of telecommunications and internet connectivity that really goes everywhere, right? That is most of the landmass of the world. It is where most of the people are. It is the future of economic activity. Many people say the last century was the U.S. century, and the next century will be China century. So at just kind of a broad level, and you can kind of debate whether some of this is good or bad, that at a broad level, this is going to allow China to dominate economically, and therefore in a related matter, militarily, this entire area and significant area of the world. Now, let's look at the kind of the benefits, kind of maybe a couple kind of categories of benefits for China. The first is that there are kind of a lot of economic benefits, right? Now, all right, there's a lot of economic benefits to these, and a lot of the core of the economic benefits come in a couple areas, right? The first is kind of trade. This is going to allow China to kind of trade and export more technology, right? Like all products, I guess I could say, into Western Europe. So that's kind of one way it would really kind of strengthen, the development of its economy, right? It's just going to kind of build these interlinkages and allow for exports. A second broad way is that it's going to allow China to gain access to raw materials that it needs to power an economy that has 1.4 billion people in it. And that's why you'll even see a little bit of this. There's some discussion of this kind of pushing into Africa or into Latin America, whether that's technically part of the Belt Road Initiative. It's kind of a small part, and it's a little probably less central to this topic, at least the way it's written. But China, whether it's called a part of the One Belt, One Road Initiative, or if it's that important to the topic, it is really not that essential. What you're seeing is China trying to gain access to a lot of raw materials and energy resources and other parts of the world to kind of support its large population. And this One Belt Road Initiative does this. The third thing is it really allows it to support its own industries. Now, China obviously has like a high growth rate, okay, and has a lot of demand within China for some core elements of its industries, right? So for its steel, aluminum, and cement, there's a pretty high demand within China for that, right? It's developing railroads within China. It has its own energy industry within China related to nuclear power, solar and wind energy. There is internal demand, but one problem that China is kind of facing is that the demand is not increased recently as much as it has. So China essentially has a little bit of like an overcapacity problem. So the government has heavily invested. So in China you do have like a lot of private companies, but the dominant players are what are called SOEs, or state-owned enterprises, or at least state-backed enterprises. So these are companies that are run or like owned by the government, or in some cases just substantially backed by the government. And China directly has invested in these industries, and it has got a lot of people in China to invest in the stock market. Just like the stock market in the U.S., people take money, they invest in this, and then over the long term, they're supposed to get expect at least, no guarantees, but you're expected to kind of get a return in this market that's greater than your investment. And China's got a lot of people, its citizens. It's really encouraged people to invest in these markets, not only for their own individual long-term health, but Xi will say, hey, if we have this capital, if we have this money, then we can promote the China dream, right? We can build the Belt Road. We can build these enormous buildings. We can build new roads. We can build trains. We can have all this energy. We can have our China dream. Well, the people have put a lot of their personal wealth into these markets, right? Into these stock markets, in these industries, and there's been a lot of heavy investment in this industry. So there's a lot of capacity in these industries. There's a lot of goods that have been produced, but there's a little bit of essentially what you might call an overproduction or a greater capacity beyond what China needs in the domestic market. And what you're facing with is a situation where you kind of have kind of this essentially overcapacity, but you also have a lot of not a lot of unemployment. You have a significant amount of unemployment and potential unemployment just because you have efficiencies within the systems, right? When the U.S. industrialized, right, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, things were very labor intensive. Okay, so there a lot of people became employed in these industries. Industry is not as labor intensive as it used to be. So China needs to both find jobs for what some evidence says is kind of like 30 million young men. It needs to kind of make sure they're employed. It needs to make sure that the people who have invested all this money into the markets are going to see a return on their investments, or at least not lose money that they've invested. Well, since there's not as much internal demand within China, China needs to find places for goods to be exported. It needs to find goods to be exported, and it needs to build things and engage in construction projects like the Belt Road. And some people say that, you even go far as to say this is kind of a stimulus for China as a way for the government to get resources kind of invested in projects that build and create economic activity. So China is looking to export things like steel, aluminum, and cement, okay? It's looking to kind of develop rail resources, which consume a lot of steel. It has a lot of capacity to produce solar power and wind power, renewable energy. It's probably the world leader in this, but like I said, there's only so much demand within China, so they'd love it for Europe to participate in this. It has its dredging industry, dredging ports. It's really good at dredging ports, but the demand is only kind of so high internally, so they want to go externally and dredge ports so they can support these key industries, right? And it includes things like probably even like nuclear power, right? That they want to have the more their companies and industry can be involved in building things abroad that require cement and steel is going to strengthen their cement and steel industry. If Europe were to order a bunch of nuclear reactors from China, which becomes a possibility because the Europe's own nuclear industry is atrophied a bit, and their standards kind of for nuclear power are kind of not quite so high. So if China can export all these products, it's going to strengthen their own industry and strengthen their dredging industry, and then obviously that can be utilized for their own purposes when they need it. But they're probably relying completely on domestic demand for that is going to be difficult. Now, so that's kind of a way, in a really broad way, that Europe kind of joining the BRI would help China, right, economically. And then economic power is obviously a lot of the foundation for military power, right? So if you have a strong economic base, you can invest more in your military. That's one way it can help China's military. It also kind of gives access, right? If China builds these ports and controls these ports overseas, then could potentially increase China's military power, which we'll talk more about on the con. But in terms of how it's good for China, right, it's going to increase their own economic activity, their own military power throughout the world. Now, it's also going to maybe provide a way for China to avoid conflict with the United States. It provides an alternative trade partner. If Trump and any future presidents are going to make it difficult for China to trade with the United States, then China needs to develop alternative trade partners. I saw an article last night that I didn't have a chance to read. It just kind of says, like, well, does he even care about the United States anymore? Does he even care about Trump? Right? It's just like, all right, if the U.S. is going to be protectionist, we'll find other countries to trade with and other ways to develop our own economy. So if Europe were to join and these ties were to increase, then maybe what will happen is that China would not be so reliant on the United States for exports, and this could reduce trade. As I mentioned, it could generally improve nuclear power development, nuclear power good, and it, of course, is generally, as I kind of been generally trying to explain at the beginning, it could promote China's overall global leadership, and you could certainly argue in the debate, there's a big debate about is it good for China to kind of rise and become the next global power? Is it maybe better off for China to be the next global power? I mean, certainly China's engaged in far fewer wars in recent history than the United States has. But the U.S., despite kind of some recent problems, is probably overall better for human rights and potentially at least one form of democracy. But you could have an overall debate about what is it better for the world, for China to be the world leader, or for the U.S. to be for the world leader. Now, in the next category of good, we can talk about why this is good for the world. Now, the first is, right, you could say the European Union, as I talked about, Europe's capital investment could sustain and kind of substantially grow the Belt Road Initiative, and you could argue that's good for the world. There's a couple reasons and evidence to back the claim that it could reduce climate change. First of all, you can say China-EU cooperation means that there's an investment into sustainable energy funds and renewable energy that is going to help meet the Paris targets. The evidence on that is pretty good. It's probably a little bit just political. How much of that will really happen, I'm not really sure. But there is evidence on that. You can also say the European Union will push China to meet climate targets and incorporate sustainable development into its projects. So there's kind of a definitely kind of an environmental dimension to this on the pro that you could argue for. You could also argue for rail routes to Europe are good. You could say rail routes are good because they reduce air pollution from planes and they reduce ocean pollution from ships. The third thing is you could talk about why it's good for China to promote development, because you could say China's development model is best. That the BRI is kind of based on a more socialist, or what I talked about in terms of state-managed capitalism alternative to global development. Like I said, China's model of economic activity includes a capitalist component. You can go to China, you can see Apple Computer, Marriott Hotel, all the major Western brands. Those are the most influential products. You can see skyscrapers. There are people making a lot of money in China in terms of kind of industries and commercial opportunities. There is a lot of capitalism and opportunities for people to make money, but that is more managed by the state, okay? International companies, it's difficult for them to do business if they don't partner with a Chinese company. There is protectionism, which is, in other words, there are a lot of tariffs that make it difficult for U.S. companies to do business. So as much as we complain about Chinese tariffs, there are tariffs. Before Trump even put on tariffs, there were tariffs by China. They do have kind of relatively closed internet networks. Unless you have what's called a VPN, you can't use Google in China, so their industries are protected. You may have heard about all this recent controversy with the Huawei phone, right? The Huawei technology company that has also developed these 5G networks, right? Which is really the part of that that's controversial. Well, that is a company that was started by a general in the Chinese military, and it was really substantially protected and developed with the support of the Chinese government. So there's still capitalism, but it's state managed, and China says that helps protect its strategic industries. It also makes sure that the work, that there's kind of, you could say the workers are treated better, that there is kind of some public recirculation of the goods. That's different than a model of the U.S. that the U.S. promotes and has promoted since the end of World War II in developing countries, which is more just capitalism without state management, right? People say, well, that's socialism. We don't want socialism. We don't want state management. We want industries to come and go. If they overproduce, like many of the Chinese industries did, as I just discussed, then those industries should fall, right? But China believes strongly in the state management of industries, in all industries, not just critical industries like the auto industry. Like the U.S. government stepped in and bailed out the auto industry because we viewed it, well, one of the reasons we viewed it as a strategic industry, right? If the auto industry collapses, it's hard to make things like tanks and jeeps that you might need in a war, okay? But China has so the U.S. will protect its strategic industries, but is not so protective of all other industries, or at least most other industries, the way that China is. So you could kind of get into a debate about what overall development model is best, because the Belt and Road Initiative is going to promote kind of China's development model. And you can debate about whether like that form of democracy is good or bad, or whether the socialism is good or bad, right? So I think that there could be a big debate about that. You could also say it could also potentially reduce debt traps. Debt trap, and some people will say debt trapping occurs when China makes a large investment in something like a port. But the idea is that the country would use the port and generate economic activity in the port so they could pay back China. Well, some people say what happens is that, and this did happen essentially kind of happened in Sri Lanka, that the countries so China makes a loan, the port gets built, but the country can't repay it. There's not enough activity. So China essentially kind of then goes in and takes over these ports or these strategic assets. And what happening with Sri Lanka is now China has a 99-year lease there. They didn't physically take over the asset. Maybe they would have if they wouldn't have worked out a deal because they would have claimed their debt was not being repaid. But they have a 99-year lease to control this Sri Lankan port. Now, this is kind of potentially a problem with the Belt and Road Initiative, right? That it allows, it's not so good for the world, right? In terms of looking at what's so good for the world, it might be good for China, but it's not so good for the world. But the argument is that if you go in there, that maybe and more European capital is provided, and Europe gets a larger influence, then this quote unquote debt trapping will be reduced. You could also kind of have a general debate about kind of overall U.S. kind of leadership and the role of Chinese leadership and the role of what's called in multipolarity. So if you took Latin, you'll know that multi means one. All right, so there was a long time since World War II, one leader, one pole, one kind of central kind of power. Now power is getting at least kind of divided in the world. At least, the world was for a while kind of bipolar in the sense that you had the U.S. and Russia, though Russia was an economic power, certainly a military power, and the U.S. and Russia each possessed approximately 30,000 nuclear weapons at one point. So you had kind of a lot of essentially bipolar competition, but you really had, especially after the Soviet Union collapsed, you really had a unipolar world led by the United States. Well, if you under this initiative, you have at the very least a return to bipolarity, but probably more multipolarity because Russia's trying to, kind of growing its power a little bit. And then this would create kind of the rise in strength of the EU. So you either kind of have a world, you certainly have a world that's at least more multipolar and at the very least a substantial rise in kind of China's power, right? And a kind of a diminution of U.S. power. The U.S. still would remain as a strong leader in the world. It's just that power would be dispersed more equally, right? Especially as China cements economic ties with at least 28 European countries, kind of under the probably hurting relations with the United States, which I'll talk about. But you can say that this overall balance of multipolar power is kind of more likely to produce peace in the world. If the U.S. has too much power, it's more likely, after the end of when Russia collapsed in the late 80s, the Soviet Union, I should say, collapsed in the late 80s, early 1990s, right? And the U.S. was a unipolar power. We did intervene, right, in a lot of countries, Libya, Iraq, obviously twice, Afghanistan. We didn't really feel that our power was kind of constrained in any way. So maybe this unipolar world kind of did promote some problems, and maybe a multipolar world or a world led by China is better. You can also kind of make a related argument that the availability of capital from the EU and China means that countries can rely less on the International Monetary Fund and World Bank for loans. And some people say that those actors are actually not really the best for countries, because in order for these countries to get loans, they have to do things. They have to do things like reduce the size of their social welfare sector. Why? Because the lenders want more of the money to go to pay back the loan. So some people say that's actually bad. It hurts the poor. China and really the EU potentially through the Belt and Road Initiative would not impose these conditions. It probably would have been better if I would have grouped this argument with the alternative development model arguments, but you get the basic idea there in terms of kind of all these things at the end. These last few arguments in terms of how they were grouped are kind of talking about different development models for the world, whether we're going to have capitalism or state-managed capitalism, whether the U.S. should kind of be like this kind of singular global leader, really kind of promoting these this particular model of capitalism on the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, which are arguably creations of the United States, or at least heavily influenced by them. If the Europe were to join China, right, in this general kind of initiative to build all these trade routes and build these common economic ties and now even kind of common internet networks, then this kind of really could kind of challenge this U.S. model and U.S. driven model or U.S. based model, and you could debate on the pro that this you could say this is desirable. Now let's look kind of at the flip side of the coin. What is the con? Well, I'll do the same kind of thing. Bad for Europe, bad for China, bad for the world. I think the strongest, or at least the easiest argument in this debate on the con is that this would really disrupt relations with the United States. Now, obviously, some Eastern European countries have joined. Eastern European countries, after the fall of the Soviet Union, did integrate a bit more with the West, but they're not really kind of like our core allies. I mean, some of them are members of NATO. We do provide support to them, right? But they're not like like France, right? Like Germany, right? If in Germany, which is the strongest economy right now in Europe, and one of the only, a lot of people say that like Germany is kind of carrying the economic weight of Europe. But regardless of getting into the details of that, if Europe were to join this, this would, like I said at the beginning, is quite a significant move. As this piece of evidence says, this is a big shift in the strategic direction and historical alliances. Like, the United States does not want China to become the global leader and to displace its power. The United States does not want China to have all this economic power that it can use to back its military and a Belt Road Initiative that it can use to build its footprint. It does not want Eurasia to fall under the control of China. So the United States would be very unhappy with Europe if it did this, to say the least. And then you have Trump, who's kind of always saying, hey, our allies are not committed and supportive enough. He would be even kind of angrier maybe than your kind of average U.S. politician. You should remember from our earlier discussion that Europe recently launched its own project to counter this, the connectivity project. So this would really hurt U.S.-European relations. And you could read impacts to that about trade. You could see trade's important to the U.S. economy, see trade's important to the European economy. You can say a weakening of ties weakens the resolve of our alliances, the credibility of our alliances, the credibility of our security commitments, which might make kind of Russia more tempted to be aggressive in these areas, to be aggressive in Europe. Russia's always probing for weaknesses. Russia kind of did invade part of the Ukraine. So there can be economic impacts to this. There can be security impacts to this. These are all things that you can develop, and I would say that you should, because I think the link is really strong and can be explained really well in the debate, especially when if the pro is talking about how much this is going to economically tie Europe into China, how much is it going to increase China's influence, and just kind of explaining that Europe has kind of decided not to do this, for at least partly or maybe even largely, because it does not want to alienate, it does not want to kind of break the West, right? It wants to maintain these Western alliances and trade groupings. So I just think in terms of the link, this is like a super strong argument. You can debate out the impact. Now, why might it be bad for Europe, all right? Why might, that's a problem. The other thing is you can say that the requirements that it places on European companies are bad. That Europe, remember, part of the reason that it might be good for Europe that we talked about earlier is that Europe would get this capital investment from China. Well, that may impose certain requirements on the way the European companies could operate. You could also say it could hurt Europe's economy. We talked earlier about the benefits of the economy, and I think that for Europe, and that will become a common pro-contention, but there are also some problems. The first is it disrupts trade ties with the United States, which I just discussed. The second is there's a lot of good evidence that says if Europe gets more loans from China, I just talked about the capital, the European companies will just become dependent on the loans. And they won't necessarily increase exports because it's hard to increase exports to China because, as discussed, China protects like a lot of its own industries, and it makes it difficult for European countries and the United States to export into China. And there's a lot of recent evidence on this, and that even there's evidence that says when China reaches agreements with other countries to allow them to increase their exports to China, that they don't always follow through essentially on complying with these agreements. So if the companies take on all these loans from Chinese banks essentially, and then have struggled to export the new products that they've produced to China, then they're going to have to repay these loans, and there's just going to be kind of a greater exodus of capital out of Europe and into China, strengthening China's power, and kind of relatively speaking, at least, at the expense of Europe. And just kind of general evidence that says China will continue to dominate these trade relationships. So I think you can definitely, the con arguments as to why it hurts the economy are also quite strong, maybe even potentially stronger than the pro arguments. Now, the second set of arguments here, you could say that Europe is going to get access to China's 5G technology and be on China's 5G networks. And I already talked about that, so I won't go into all the details, but there's evidence that says that will lead to China being able to spy on Europe, that it's going to threaten Europe's cyber security. We can also make arguments about the Internet of Things, which I talked about earlier, are bad. Importantly, you can say this is going to give China access to more data. Artificial intelligence, and I won't go to at a broad level, is kind of really based on the idea of machines learning from data points. Like, how do humans behave in particular situations? It can study the behavior based on the collection of all this data. Well, the U.S. is kind of ahead of China a little bit in artificial intelligence right now, but most people say that, and it is true, that China's investments in this, especially at the government level, are higher than the United States. And China has more people, so it has more data points, right? It already has a lot of data because it already has, I say, 1.5 billion people versus 350 million in the U.S., 500 million in Europe. But imagine you have 500 million Europeans or somewhere close to it to a 5G network. That gives China a lot more data to work with, especially since all the people in China are not kind of as easily connected, right? There's a lot of in the West, there's a lot of poverty and people kind of quote unquote off the grid a bit, whereas you have all these people in Europe kind of come onto this 5G network, strengthening China's artificial intelligence, potentially allowing it to surpass the United States. That has military and economic implications. And this 5G has been very controversial. The U.S. has actually kind of recently restricted U.S. companies kind of creating some ties with Huawei, which is the leading kind of Chinese company that's developing this technology. It's been very controversial, and in the news, and the links to this argument are quite good. And it is pretty interesting, so I think it is something that debaters will end up debating about a lot. You could also debate it about on the pro. I didn't emphasize it as much there just because the impacts to it seem a little stronger on the con. So I think this will be a common contention that people will make. You could say that BRI supports a multipolar world, as I just explained a few minutes ago, but you could say this is bad and it's bad for Europe. You can say it undermines Europe's trade standards, including its investment standards, its labor standards, its environmental standards, all the standards that Europe has worked hard to incorporate into trade agreements to protect the environment, to protect workers, to kind of determine investment and make sure it's fair and make sure it's repaid. China may just kind of come in and kind of push its own standards again, since they're the ones that are bringing in all the capital. It could cause some infighting within Europe. Now, obviously, when you say the Europeans should join, that creates kind of a unified approach, but there could be a lot of infighting in kind of the terms of implementation, like where does countries that obviously maybe fight over where the corridor is going to be built. They all maybe say, okay, we agree to join this, right? But now we're going to fight about where to build essentially these seaports and kind of these land or trading points, which companies from which countries are going to actually benefit from the Chinese contracts, how much capital is going to be taken on, what's it going to be used for, which European banks and lending institutions or general financiers are going to kind of profit from this, how is this going to kind of strengthen one European country at the expense of another? So even though there could be a lot of unity in the decision to join, the implementation could kind of get maybe kind of a bit nasty or controversial. You could obviously say this would promote China's world leadership, and I just talked about that, right? Like, say that this is actually bad for China to become the world leader. It's better for the U.S. to retain its world leadership. That China-dominated Eurasia will replace the U.S.-led global liberal world order. There's been more articles written about what's called the global liberal order. So the global liberal order kind of came about after World War II, when we kind of the U.S.'s general approach, right, to promoting, to trying to stop another war was to build institutions like the United Nations. And these institutions, of course, promoted Western values like democracy, because, look, the West won World War II. If we had lost, the world would have become a different place. To promote ideals like democracy, to promote free trade, to promote a liberal capitalist form of economic development, to try to bind countries to international law and humanitarian obligations and Western alliances, all stuff that Trump has, to say it kind of softly, has cast doubt on, and are coming under a lot of pressure due to the rise of not just Trump, but other nationalist leaders, and the potential for these to create kind of conflict, like around conflict around the world. And there's evidence that even says that the BRI and China's rise will directly challenge this global liberal order, and you can argue that it is good. You can say there's an increased threat from China, as I talked about. This gives China more money to invest into its military. If China takes over these ports through things like debt trapping, it kind of provides a way for China to have ports for its military. Look down in there around what we called kind of that Indochina, India-China area in the southern Pacific, in related seas, that China will be able to project a lot of power in that area. Some people say it could reduce U.S. port access if other countries, especially in Europe, allow China to build and develop and control their own ports. Combine this with 5G networks, debt trapping. You can see these are all could create a lot of kind of dominance in these areas. You can say that the BRI promotes this model. I talked about this alternative model of development, and that actually model is bad, that it's better to have an entirely free market or mostly free market, capitalist-based driven development, that this kind of type of liberal democracy is actually better for the developing world. You can make human rights arguments, that China violates human rights, that if Europe joins the Belt Road Initiative, China won't criticize Europe on human rights and kind of continue to push them to improve their human rights standards. You could say that Europe should not engage human rights violators at all, that instead Europe should shun China. There's a body of philosophical literature that says you should not collaborate with human rights abusers. You can say there are human rights violations during the BRI project. The Pro expands the BRI, which you could also say is another link to democracy. I found some evidence just yesterday that says that there's a kind of a lot of corruption within these projects that are financed by China, and that China uses these projects as a way to kind of provide financial support to other dictators or other autocrats in the world. You could say that it's bad to develop the alternative energy technologies that are talked about, that I talked about earlier, that these could actually hurt the economies of oil-producing countries, and over the long term, if it kind of really suppress or lower energy prices, that it makes it actually harder to develop alternative energy on a macro scale. That's called backstopping. I don't want to go into that argument in detail. It's been made on other topics, but just kind of generally any arguments about why renewable energy is bad. You could also say that like wind farms like kill birds, and that solar energy produces like dangerous mercury pollution, and they rely on the rare earth minerals and metals to operate in the first place, which involves a lot of environmental destruction and involves these kind of getting out of China and the developing world that often don't have a lot of strong environmental laws. So just any kind of arguments against renewable energy. You could also make arguments against nuclear power. As I said, the Belt and Road Initiative could promote the development of China's nuclear power industry. I also found another article last night that said the Belt and Road Initiative was leading kind of China to develop over 30 new nuclear reactors that were going to be sold. So you could also debate about nuclear power. I should kind of one other kind of related point there. There's evidence that says that it's going to, I have that here, is going to promote China's aggression kind of in the South China Sea that enables it economic and militarily to support that. You could talk about environmental problems, right? That especially if this is going to kind of, as I say, Europe's capital is going to get injected into the area and it's going to support kind of a broader development of the initiative. There's evidence that says it's going to lead to more deforestation as these roads are built. You can say it's going to lead to more dams and more dams being built. I just talked about nuclear power and solar power, the environmental harms of those. You can just say trade between countries uses a lot of energy to kind of move goods and parts kind of back and forth. That there are a lot of kind of general, just kind of in general, environmental harms. You can say that it's bad for countries to become economically dependent on China. This is just going to strengthen China's kind of global power and leadership and kind of make it difficult for them to develop on their own. You can say that it supports a strong dredging industry and that a strong dredging industry supports, as I just mentioned a bit ago, China's aggression in the South China Sea. So to go back to think too, if you want to kind of make these general arguments, you need to kind of link Europe into kind of strengthening overall the Belt Road Initiative, which I think you can, just conceptually, even that first quote says whoever, controls trade from the east of Eurasia to the west of Eurasia is going to kind of control the world. It's going to substantially impact it, and especially maybe not even in terms of geographic size. You can see even at that little original graphic and image just showed Europe up there at the top in the little bit, right? That was kind of that gray area. That's a smaller geographic area, but it has a lot of the world's economic activity in it. So in that way, it's going to broadly support it, but also just in terms of the investment, the needed investment that the European Union could kind of leverage and bring to the BRI would substantially strengthen it. Now, I just want to kind of quickly end. I could have talked more about the resolution at the beginning, but it is kind of rather straightforward. I did talk about the two terms, the European Union, this entity of, common economic policy, essentially political policy and some security, right? Europe's going to have a common economic, political, and security policy, maybe social policy. It's not debatable what the European Union is. It's also kind of not really that debatable about what the Belt and Road Initiative is. It includes a land component, a sea component, and now we can see an internet or telecommunication component. Now, there are a couple things within that, so, excuse me, I didn't think like a detailed kind of analysis of the resolution was necessary. Now, there's a couple of components within that, to think about what does it really mean to join it, especially since it's a concept. It would probably more mean endorsing it, maybe just say they're joining it. It's not, the BRI, as I've explained and as the evidence in our file indicate, is not it's not a legal entity. It's not like a concept. It's something that's kind of controlled by China, but in terms of whether or not you join it, probably just really says you sign up to be a part of it. But you could debate that. It might have some relevance for some arguments. You could say, well, joining it assumes that Europe really won't be subject to China's trade standards because it's not a legal thing that they join. But anyhow, I think there's a little, I don't have a lot of finalized thoughts on that, but I think you maybe could debate a little bit about what the word join means and what that means for arguments on each side. Now, the other thing you need to think about is like what perspective or framework should be adopted, right? You're going to say, look, this is good for Europe. Europe is the actor in the resolution, so obviously the pros and cons of what it means for Europe are relevant, all right? And people are going to say countries and entities should act on their own interests. So Europe's interests are clearly relevant in terms of any type of framework debate. But look, Europe also has allies, such as the U.S., and allies kind of generally look out for one another, right? So that's also in their interest to potentially look out for the interests of the United States. Third, like all countries and individuals have an interest in kind of generally promoting peace. So anything that increases the risk of war, certainly wars that would affect Europe are kind of within the framework of Europe's own best interests. But beyond that, there is a debate about what obligations countries have beyond your countries or entities such as the EU have to individuals kind of outside their kind of country or framework, and that a country or organization, I'm referring here to the EU as an organization. And obviously, like lately, there is a lot more nationalism in the world, certainly than there was like 10 years ago, or really even 5 years ago. So now you hear common things like, well, it doesn't, people state this in PF as it's just a truth factor, right? Well, the actor is the United States, or the actor is Europe. So the only thing that matters is what people, how it impacts people in their own country or entity, because it's the only thing people care about. People say that as a kind of statement of fact, really, because they kind of, indirectly, directly, like they kind of have bought into this nationalist messaging. Even if they don't like Trump, they'll still say, well, the only thing that really matters is for a country is its own people, right? But this is kind of a change in worldview, right? Like I'm saying, even 10 years ago, certainly from post-World War II to 10 years ago, we have like a broader worldview, right? Like there is an interest in global economic development and reducing poverty, and people say we have obligations to the U.S. The U.S., even though now, like, we're separating families at the border and making little kids sleep on the cold cement, like we have signed on to conventions and to protect refugees, and we did after World War II. And this was a little bit self-serving because a lot of the refugees at the time were Western Europeans, right? Because they were involved in a huge war. They were Jewish people who were victims of the Holocaust. So we kind of saw it in our self-interest to help refugees, because we probably imagined that future refugees would be us. But now that we don't see that future refugees aren't us, we don't care. We only kind of seem to care about ourselves. But there is kind of a huge debate about whether or not countries have obligations, countries and entities have obligations to people outside their borders, and you can definitely kind of explore that literature, and I put some of that evidence in the file, and you've debated it. Some of you have debated it, some of these other PF topic areas and resolutions. So I encourage you to kind of think a little bit broader beyond the simple statement of does this benefit the EU in terms of your framework debates and in terms of assessing your arguments.